Hello, we're going to talk a little bit about Patchbays today. First, you should know that there are three different styles of Patchbays. There's the MT or military telephone, aka long frame, which looks kind of like a 1/4-inch TRS, but it's not compatible with it, and you will damage an MT Patchbay if you take a normal 1/4-inch plug and plug it into that Patchbay. The reason is it's slightly smaller. But it looks similar to it. It still has a tip, ring, and a sleeve, so it's a balanced interconnection, just like a 1/4-inch TRS. But again, it's slightly smaller, so if you use the standard 1/4-inch phone plug and plug it into the Patchbay, you will damage it. Next, we have tiny telephone, or TT, or also called Bantam. Just a smaller version of MT. The reason it's smaller is so you can get more patch points in the same amount of physical space. So let's take a look at that one here. Again, same thing. This is what you have in Studio B and most of the other typical Patchbays. So those smaller, but not quite as small as a mini headphone jack type of plug. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this at this point. And of course, there are Patchbays made from standard 1/4-inch TRS phone plugs. Just the same as your large size headphones or instrument plugs, things like that. Now there aren't terribly many rules that you have to follow because you can configure a Patchbay however you want. But you do have to follow one specific rule, is that the top row of the Patchbay is for device outputs or sends. And the bottom row is for device inputs or returns. That's really the only thing you have to follow. There are a lot of things you should follow, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But that's really the only rule of placement. Now, we're going to talk a lot about normaling, and there's three different kinds of normaling. But when normaling is implemented, it's simply a connection between the top row, the device output, to the bottom row, the device input. So for example here, when we look at this Patchbay, the top row, this point would then be connected to this point if we have normaling configured for that jack field. And again, in number 2, this one would be connected to the one directly below it. There are three types of normaling. There's, of course, not normaling. That's a type of normaling, with there being no connection between the rows whatsoever. Half normaling is where there's a connection between the top and bottom row, but the connection can be broken and is only broken when you plug in a patch cord into the bottom jack. So for example, a signal will still flow from the top row to the bottom row of that particular jack field if you have something plugged into the top row, but it will be disconnected and will be fed from the Patchbay, from the patch cord when you plug it into the bottom row, and it will disconnect that row on top. Fully normaled, similar to half normaled, still sends the signal from the top row to the bottom row, but the connection between those rows is broken when you plug into either jack. So whether you plug into the top or plug into the bottom, that connection is broken between the two. Just to give you a quick wiring diagram of what fully and half normal jack fields look like. So this side here, this mixer output socket, this is where you would plug in your patch cord into. This patch cord would go into this way. And this is the bottom row, so this is the input to an input device. So this is where you'd plug, say, an output of something you're patching into the front of the jack field. It would go in there into this side here. Now what makes these interesting is that there are these connection points between the two jack fields. Down here, this is a half normaled system where this jack field is considered normaled, but this top jack here is not normaled. What we mean by that is when we have a normaled jack, there are these additional connection points there that are wired. Now in this one you can see these additional connection points are not wired, so thus we're considering this one half normaled, because only half of the jack fields are normaled, are wired in normal mode. So this here These wires are connected up to the hot and cold, or pins 2 and 3, or the plus and minus, however you want to refer to them as. So what happens when you plug something into the bottom row, these contacts will be lifted up because there's going to be the patch cord plug inserted into here. It lifts this physical contact up, and this point right here becomes disconnected. And same when it comes in, this connection point is pushed down, and so this connection point here is disconnected. So when there's a plug inserted into the bottom jack field, this point and this point are then disconnected, which means it's no longer connected physically to the top row. And that's how physically the jack field works and how normaling works. So you plug something in and it disconnects these contacts, which are normally connected to the one above it. Let's move over to the fully normaled section here. And you can see fully normaled is simply where the normaling is enabled on both jack fields. So here you plug something into the bottom row and it disconnects these contacts, and so thus it disconnects from the top row. And here if you plug something in, it again disconnects this point and this point when a plug is inserted in here, and so it disconnects the connection between the top and bottom rows. So that's the difference between fully normaled and half normaled. Again, in a half normaled sense, half normaled situation, only plugging something into the bottom row will disconnect between the top. And over here, whether you plug something into the top or the bottom row, it will disconnect the connection between those two jack fields. Here's a little close-up, and this is the empty or long frame jack field here. So we have the patch cord plugged into here. It's making contact here with the springs here, and as the plug is in here, it's lifting these up and away from these normaling contacts right here and right up here. So when the plug is taken out, these contact bars here will spring back down and make contact again with these pieces here. And what happens is this bar then goes back and is wired to the jack field above it. So that's where these contacts are made. If we look back here, this is the wiring diagram version of this contact point here and this contact point here, which then wire up to the other jack field. These are the contact points in a real jack field. So how do you get this to work for you? And how can you use it to your advantage? Now, we did talk about that there's only really one rule, that you have to have your outputs on the top row and inputs on the bottom row. But there's a whole lot of, well, you really should do this or it's going to not really work out well sort of rules as well. So we're going to talk about those here. Really the goal is to use the normaling function to your advantage so that you use as few patch cords as possible. Because let's face it, if you're in a recording system, situation, you don't want to have to patch in 800 patch cords just to get a basic session going. You want to be able to record or mix down. You don't have to patch in 8 cables all at once just to get 8 tracks from your multi-track return or multi-track recorder. You want it to be as easy to use as possible with as few patches as possible, because patch cords can go bad. You just don't want to have to deal with the hassle. It's easier to recall, easier to document, just easier overall. So make your life easier and put the Patchbay to work for you in that sense. So let's take this sample Patchbay from Whirlwind as an example. It's out of their documentation. It's a bit old, so you may notice it is based on a 4-track recording studio. But in any event, we have a multi-track recorder. Multi-track recorder's outputs. So outputs 1 through 4 are wired to the back of the top rows 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they are half normaled to each jack below it. So this connection 1, multi-track channel 1, is now feeding the console line input 1, and the console line input 1 is wired to the bottom row of the jack, the bottom row of the Patchbay here into jack number 1, and console line input 2 to jack field 2, 3, 4, etc., all the way up to 12. So without requiring any patch cords whatsoever, multi-track outputs 1 through 4 are connected to console inputs 1 through 4. Pretty simple. And again, let's say we have a CD output here in this case, just for playback purposes. Maybe we want to play back something and re-record it in, or just monitor it. So those are wired to the Patchbay inputs, or outputs rather, 5 and 6, and the console inputs are connected to the Patchbay's inputs 5 and 6. So the left is 5, the right is 6, and likewise, so inputs 5 and 6 are going to be the CD left and right on the console without having to patch anything. And again, it goes on. We have a reverb, 2-track outs. That's another like a CD player or a 2-track recorder, something like that. Again, going to channels 7 and 8. Here we have an interesting case, a reverb, effects unit left and right out, being normaled to console inputs 9 and 10. So without having to patch anything in, you automatically have a reverb coming up on channels 9 and 10. So you can do your EQing, level adjustments during mixdown without requiring any patches. And again, here's another effects out, left and right, going to inputs 11 and 12 of your mixing console. Moving on, we have a group out. So these are subgroup outputs from the mixing console that are now going to feed multi-track inputs 1 through 4. So if we're doing tracking, our subgroups 1 through 4 now are going to be recorded by the multi-track recorder, again without any patching required, because they are normaled from top to the bottom row. Stereo bus out, this is our main master mix left and right out from the mixing console, connected to 17 and 18. And here we have our master recorder inputs left and right. So without requiring any patches, again, we can record directly from the main mix left and right output of the console into our master recorder. In this case, might be a CDR, might be, in a more modern sense, some spare inputs of a DAW that we're re-recording things down. So, and here's another creative use of it, taking an aux send out 1 and 2. That's now normaled to a reverb effects unit. So now, without requiring any patching, you can just crank up aux sends 1 and 2 and get to a reverb unit. Now you'll notice over here that there are no arrows between the two. So in this case, we're making use of the not normaling whatsoever feature, because most of the times you will want to normal something together. But in this case, we have a compressor output and a gate output and a compressor in. So this is one device. We wouldn't want to wire the inputs and the outputs of a compressor to itself, would we? Well, no, of course not. So thus, we're not using normaling, but they are up and wired to the Patchbay so that we can patch it in somewhere if we want to. And again, same thing with the gate. There's no reason to patch the gate to itself because it would just really create kind of its own feedback loop. So that seems kind of silly. So again, there's no normaling. So in this sense, most things are going to be half normaled, but in this case, we're not using any normaling whatsoever. They're just available in the Patchbay for use. All right, now we're going to discuss a couple Patchbay layout tips. Again, we mentioned that the only rule, the only hard and fast rule that you must follow is that you should have the outputs on top and the inputs on the bottom row. Well, there's one more rule that you really should abide by, although it won't cause you to fail because you can always get around it by using patch cords. But one of those other rules that you really should do is to always normal your insert sends to your insert returns, whether they are channel insert sends and returns, or group or subgroup insert sends and returns, or your master left and right stereo bus insert sends and returns. They should always be normal to themselves, because as you recall, an insert send is a diversion path for the channel strip or the group or the master mix bus. So it goes out, but it must come back in. So if it doesn't come back in, you've broken the signal flow within the console. So you always have to make sure that the insert sends and returns are normaled to each other. You can choose full or half normaling, doesn't really matter. Most people tend to use half normaling because it does give you more flexibility. Because if you think about it, you can plug in something to the insert send, take it somewhere, but because it's half normaled and you're only plugging it into the top row, it does not break the signal path between the top jack field and the bottom jack field in the Patchbay because it's only half normaled. So you can take something and take that insert send it out somewhere else. You can kind of grab a copy of that signal, patch it in somewhere else, and you're not disrupting the signal flow down that channel path. So it's kind of handy. It gives you another copy of the signal. But again, when you do patch it in back, let's say you're going to a compressor, you take it from the insert send to the input of a compressor, and then the output of the compressor back into the insert return. When you plug it back into the insert return, it is breaking that connection then between the top and bottom row, so that the insert return is getting its signal from the compressor output. Because otherwise you'd have kind of a jamming of signals between the insert send and the top row, and then the compressor out that's patched into the bottom row. So that's why you always want to make sure that that connection is broken in the bottom row. So the bottom row is always normaled if it's in a normaling sense, because it's always going to break that connection. Because as you can't jam inputs together. You can go from one output using a Y cable to multiple inputs, but you can never have multiple outputs going to a single input. You can't use a Y cable in reverse and cram the signal together. So that's why that bottom row is always going to be normaled, and when you plug it in, it's going to break the connection between the top and bottom rows of the patch bay. So insert sends and returns, always normal them together. Half normaling is most common. Never normal aux sends to aux returns. Because again, aux sends are just simply a copy of a signal being sent out. It's not part of the channel path. So if you're going to take that back into the aux return, you can crank up the aux return, and then suddenly you would just get possibly an out-of-phase copy of that signal. So it's just kind of looping it through again through multiple paths, so that wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense. Main mix out. Always normal that to your mastering recorder, whether it's a CDR from the good old days or your DAW inputs, whatever you're recording your master 2-track mix to, stereo mix. And again, a little tip, if you half normal this, then you can take a pair of patch cords, plug it into the main mix output in the top row of the patch bay, and then send that to another destination. Utilizing the features of the patch bay, it's not going to disconnect from the top row to the bottom row, so you're not interrupting that signal flow from the main mix out to the mastering recorder. But you can also then take a copy of that signal and send it somewhere else. So again, leveraging the features of the half normaling configuration of that patch bay. Taking a control room out to your monitor amps. Well, that's a control room out, or it might be listed as speaker out, I think, on the Toft, or alternate speaker out on the Toft as well. Now here's a sense where if you only have one control room out, or one near field monitor out for your studio monitors, if you only have one output, this is a case where you may want to consider using a fully normaled patch bay configuration. Because if you're taking the control room out, patching that into, say, an alternate set of monitor inputs, let's say you have maybe an active set of monitors, or you have another passive set of monitors, so you're taking that control room out and patching it into the amplifier inputs. Well, you wouldn't necessarily want to have two sets of monitors going at the exact same time. So here, if you plug into the top row, if it's fully normaled, then once you plug into the top row, it disconnects between the bottom row. So now you're sending that control room out to your second set of monitors, but it's disconnecting, it's breaking the connection within the patch bay to the bottom row of the patch bay. So you're no longer sending that same signal to your original or your regular set of monitors. Because who wants two sets of monitors going at the same time? I don't know, not me, so probably not you either. Okay, now for aux sends, you're going to want to consider normaling these two things, such as your Q mix, you have a reverb or effects unit that you like to use, your kind of your go-to effects unit, things that you would normally patch into your aux sends. Consider just normaling them, because again, the name of the game is minimizing patch cord usage. So, and let the patch bay, let its features be helpful to you. One less patch cord is one less point of failure in the system. We've all had the bad patch cords, so let the patch bay do its job for you. Same with aux returns. Take your favorite reverb out and then normal that to an aux return. It's again an easy way to just make your sessions a little bit simpler, easier to document. Console bus group outputs. The bus, whether it's spelled BUS or BUSS or group or subgroup, however the manufacturer decides to label it, those subgroup outputs traditionally have been normaled to multi-track recorder inputs. But again, in this day and age, where we're seeing more DAWs, more project studios where we don't really have those 24 and 32 bus or 32 subgroup SSL mixing consoles in daily use, you could consider taking your direct outs to your DAW, which is going to be your multi-track in many cases in these project studios. So in larger studios, yeah, you will see the console and bus group outputs going to your multi-track, but in your project studios, the direct out to your DAW interface is probably going to be the more common situation. But in any event, the multi-track recorder outputs, so during playback and mixing, you want to feed those into your console tape returns if they are available. In the Toft case, that's your monitor input of the channel strip, or the MON, as I discussed in another video. In the Mackie, it is actually called a tape return. So it's just a matter of how the console deals with it. If it has the flexibility for a dedicated set of multi-track inputs, then obviously you want to normal those from the multi-track recorder outputs. Mic inputs. This is kind of a special case, and we discussed this in class a little bit about never using microphone patching on a TRS, a TT, or an MT/long frame Patchbay. And the reason for that is as you plug in the patch cord into the jack field, for a split second in time, certain conductors will be shorted out together, like either pin 2 in ground or pin 3 in ground, the tip or sleeve against ground. The bottom line is you do not want to short anything against the ground, any of those conductors together, because if your 48 volt phantom power supply, which is running over pins 2 and 3, if that's shorted to ground, or if pins 2 and 3 are shorted together, that's going to cause a big problem, because a lot of your 48 volt phantom power supplies can't handle a dead short. So you're going to short the thing out, and it could potentially damage your 48 volt phantom power supply. So you really don't want to do that. Now, I do mention here that you can use an XLR patch bay. Well, if you think about it, when you're plugging in an XLR cable, those pins don't short out as you plug it in and unplug it from an XLR receptacle. So you're not shorting anything to make that patch connection. So while yes, XLR patch bays are pretty big and bulky, and generally they're all custom made, that is an acceptable alternative if you need to do microphone patching, anything that's carrying 48 volts over there. So you really want to avoid those plug-based, the TRS, TT, or MT patch bays for using with mic inputs, just to prevent damage, because you never know when there's going to be a newbie in the studio that forgets to turn off phantom power supply when they're doing mic patching, and then poof, the magic smoke gets released from the console, and suddenly you have no more phantom volt, 48 volt phantom power supply, and that wouldn't be very good for anybody. So that's just kind of a thing that if anyone's considering upgrades in Studio A, you may really want to consider that. So finally, some other patch bay layout tips. Have I done this right? Just simply ask yourself a few short questions. Is every connection on the console routed to the patch bay? Well, you never know when you're going to use those obscure input or output points. Maybe you're like, well, I don't know when I'm ever going to use those subgroup monitor inputs on the Toft, but someday you just might. So make sure they're up in the patch bay in that odd instance where that would be really handy. That way you don't have to crawl behind the console and find the right kind of cables. So when you're building out your project studio, you should always have every single I/O point of the mixing console up on that patch bay. Because again, it's to make your life easier and flexibility in the future. Another question, can you record multi-track into your mastering deck without patching? If the answer is yes, then you've probably done it right. Can you send a Q mix or get to reverb? And can you monitor? Can you send all those typical recording tasks or mixdown tasks, maybe you don't have, the flexibility to do an enhanced session without patching, but can you get at least one basic reverb? Can you get a reverb return back on an aux return? Can you send something out to the Q mix during tracking? Can you monitor without patching, to your near field monitors that are in your control room? Um, can you run a basic session without patch cords? That's really the question that you want to answer yes to, and then if you can answer yes to all those things, then you're on your way to really leveraging the features of the Patchbay in your favor. And just a few final notes. What if you have leftover jack fields? They make the 48 and 96 point Patchbays, but what if you're not using all 48 or all 96? Maybe you need really, you're only using 1.5 Patchbays, so you have more than 48, so you buy two 48s or 196, and you're only using, say, 80. Well, what you can do is you can take some jack fields, wire them together, and create a mult. Maybe you've seen that in some of the studios already. It's just simply a couple jack fields that are wired together in parallel. So you can take an output, let's say you have 4 jack fields wired together. You could take an output, say, from an insert send, so it's sending a copy of that channel out, whatever. Take that into one of the 4 mult jack fields, and then the other remaining 3 mults could be used as outputs. So it's just a way to get, to kind of multiply things. It's kind of a glorified Y cable. In this case, it's more like a W cable, because you would have 1 input and 3 outputs. But that's a great way to leverage those leftover jack fields and not, kind of feel like you're wasting money by leaving empty jack fields on the table. So that's a very, very, very common use of leftover jack fields. The other, of course, is the tie line. So if you have distant locations in a facility, a great example is in between Studio A and Lutz, or maybe between Studio A and the new Lutz control room. Maybe there is one, though. Or the rehearsal rooms on the lower floors between Studio A. So those distant locations where you don't necessarily have a dedicated device always plugged in between those points, but maybe you have a spare jack on the wall for that point, you can just use it as a tie line. So it's just kind of a spare cable between those 2 distant locations. And it's also, again, just very common uses of spare patch points on your Patchbay. Well, that concludes our discussion of Patchbays for the moment. Please let me know what questions you have. Leave comments here, or send me email, whatever you choose, and we'll do more discussion in class. Thank you very much.